Okay, welcome everyone to attempt 2 of this week's episode of Heavy Hands, the Rona virus edition, numbered something, I don't know. Phil and I, we've learned the error of our ways, okay? We would like to start this episode, I think. Oh, wait, okay. I'm your host, Connor, which with me as always is Phil McKenzie. Phil, how you doing?
Not too bad.
We wanted to apologize, right, to Dana White, and Joe Silva, and Mick Maynard, and Sean Shelby, and even though they're not involved anymore, definitely the Fertitta brothers, they deserve it more than anyone. We shouldn't have asked so often for time away from the UFC schedule. Okay? We know. We just want the fights back at this point. But I don't know, Phil, how are you holding it together over there in quarantine? You doing okay?
Yeah, not too bad. Living and breathing for the moment. But yeah, it's hard, and now we find ourselves making another Faustian bargain, which is, what kind of moral choices are you willing to make to have the fights back? Because Dana White turning an island into somewhere or into the Quest, Mortal Kombat, Tekken, Enter the Dragon type scenario of your choice, aka Fight Island, was not necessarily like something which was top of my mind, but now that it's happening, there is a sort of vague, disgusted curiosity.
I, for one, am thrilled, and I cannot wait for UFC Little St. James. I think it's going to be a fucking blast.
Yeah.
Or alternatively, the island of Dr. Morone. Is that a good one for Dana White?
It's close. I mean, I'm personally looking forward to when Justin Gaethje drops out and we end up having to have Tony Ferguson versus Goro for the interim championship.
I would happily watch Tony Ferguson fight himself, like in Fight Club. Like, he's probably capable of beating him, even if no one else is. Yeah, I don't know. It's weird times, folks. Weird times. Anyway, we had internet issues during our first attempt to record this episode, and so we postponed it. Just at the top, I'll let you know that you should check out the Heavy Hands Patreon, because there is a boxing commentary vid over there. Of Mike McCallum versus Sumbu Kalambe, two of the most unheralded technicians of 1980s boxing. Two of those guys who were putting in incredible work and showing off incredible skills alongside the Four Kings in their heyday. And if you listen to some boxing fans, a lot of those guys did not want to fight people like Mike McCallum. So that one is worth checking out. But as for today's episode, later on, we are going to get into a topic. That's the sort of the modus operandi for the pandemic so far, is covering more topics, which actually I do enjoy. I like, I'll tell you this much. It'll make the first UFC event much more satisfying now that we've gotten a layoff. This is how it used to be. But there is supposedly an illicit UFC event taking place on a private island somewhere. And I guess we're going to preview some of those fights. We honestly, I don't know what the hell's going to happen next week. I don't know how much faith I should put in any aspect of this. My instinct, having encountered Dana White for years now, is very little. It's just not to really believe all that much that this event is really happening. But as it stands, it certainly looks like a pretty good card. We're supposed to be getting Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje. We're supposed to be getting Jessica Andrade, Rose Namajunas too. We're supposed to be getting Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, and Jeremy Stevens versus Calvin Kattar, and the list goes on. It's a very good looking lineup. So Lord knows how many of these fights will actually happen. But supposing this is anything like a normal fight week and doing what we normally do for stacked cards like this, we thought we would take a look 2 weeks out and cover just two of these like sort of more obscure undercard fights. So the aforementioned Vicente Luque versus Nico Price, that's on our docket. So too is Marlon Chito Vera's fight with Ray Borg. You know I love Marlon Vera. I'm very excited to see him back, as always. I don't know about that matchup, but we will get to that next. Phil, let's go ahead and jump in. Luque, Price. Now, I seem to recall yesterday you were telling me something along the lines of, and I believe I'm quoting you verbatim here, Nico Price is better than Conor McGregor. Is that what your take was?
I think what I actually said was Nico Price is exactly the same as Conor McGregor.
Oh, okay. That's right.
No, so I think what I was saying, and I would like to point out that everything I was saying was distorted by hideous amounts of Skype interference and general internet fuckery.
And that accent.
Was that Nico Price is one of those people who doesn't appear to have many physical gifts, apart from that when he hits people, it hurts them very, very badly.
Yeah.
And I've sort of maintained for a while, to some level of controversy, that this is sort of the person that Conor McGregor is as well. That he just hurts people when he hits them, and he's got a few other gifts, obviously, but like from a physical like strength and explosiveness and like all these other intangibles that we consider to make up athleticism, like Conor McGregor is not like an A-tier athlete, and
I'm with you on that.
And Nico Price is a B-tier athlete, if that.
Yeah, he's a worse Conor McGregor, but in a similar way, he makes up for a lack of plus athleticism, as the dear Dr. Patrick Wyman would have said, with just like having long arms and like big ass hands that hit really hard.
Yeah, and just being able to so which has allowed him to polish people off from weird positions and basically makes him a live dog in pretty much any fight you can put him in.
Yeah.
With that being said,
this fight... Mm-hmm. Go on, please.
Being said, this fight is both guaranteed action, but also a rematch.
Yes.
And it is a rematch in which Nico Price got absolutely clobbered. And it really does seem like it's one of the worst ones in the division for him.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. I was looking through Price's other fights, trying to figure out, like, who else has he fought that's just relentlessly pressured him like Luque? Because, you know, like, Price likes to come forward usually. Not that he's... Again, he is a much worse Conor McGregor. Certainly, McGregor makes up for his own sub, I don't know, ideal athleticism with an awful lot of skill and know-how and craft that Nico Price simply does not have. So, you know, he's not doing many like concerted efforts to come forward the whole fight. He doesn't really cut off the cage or anything like that. But I was trying to think, is there anyone else who just pressures the way Vicente Luque did, and the way he does? Because when Vicente Luque heard that Nico Price liked to meet people in the center and exchange, he became very excited, and said to himself, I'm going to do that much harder than he can, and it will be fun to find out which one falls down first. That was his thought process going in, and as it turned out, in their first fight, Nico Price, like, fought off the back foot. He really chose, I don't know, he was under the impression that it was like a savvy move to do like what, whose name am I blanking on? Who had a really impressive back foot performance like we hadn't seen? Like Max Griffin, against Mike Perry. Where just out of nowhere, he decides he's going to fight this way, and it turns out to be the perfect approach for this opponent. Well, it wasn't. Not only is Nico Price like not good at it, not only did Vicente Luque just counter the jab he tried to use with low kicks over and over until Nico just stopped throwing it because he didn't want to get kicked in the leg anymore. And then Vicente kicked him in the leg some more. Not only did all of that happen, but Vicente Luque is a much better pressure fighter than Mike Perry. All that stuff I said about how Price doesn't consistently pressure, Luque does. He cuts off the cage. He leads behind his jab. He uses kicks to corral his opponent. He works the body. He throws combinations. He is just an excellent pressure fighter who also has a great chin and huge punching power. And yeah, Price just kind of got chewed up. And I don't know, like, I guess the real question is, how does he approach it differently? Because if he does that again, I don't see it playing out much differently. Obviously, as you said, it's Nico Price. He hits really hard. He's going to exchange with Luque. I think he stung him at one point in the first fight. But if you're looking at the sort of broad strokes of the matchup, he loses if he fights off the back foot. So are you expecting him to do something different this time?
This is one of the things about Price is that he does. I don't think it was necessarily a strategic choice for him to fight off the back foot. I think he really is just a guy who accepts the fight that's given to him because he's just sure that whatever happens, a finish will just materialize. So when Luque came forward at him, he was like, well, fine, I'm going to go back. I mean, we've talked about guys like I'm also blanking on people now. The featherweight who fought Brian Ortega as being a opportunist fighter. But, I mean, Nico Price is a terrible round winner.
Yes.
I mean, legitimately awful. And, you know, of the fights that he's had, it's very hard to find rounds in which he didn't finish people that he actually won.
Yeah.
He was losing against Randy Brown. He was losing against Tim Means. I think, and then his other wins have just been so fast that they've, you know, there hasn't really been much of a back and forth at all.
And fights he loses, where even when he hurts people, he might lose like against Jeff Neal, he lost in the very round in which he actually hurt Jeff Neal with punches.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the problem is that there are a few problems here. One is that Luque is a tighter combination puncher than him. Two, Luque has a better chin than him by a reasonable margin. It's even, you know, it's tremendous credit that Price was able to hurt Luque because very few people seem to be able to do that very meaningfully.
He hurts basically everyone he fights with a totally dysfunctional, disjointed game.
Yeah, but he could hurt him, but it wasn't badly.
Right.
So Price can withstand the fire and throw back in the pocket. Luque can withstand the fire and throw back in the pocket. Luque is a better attritional fighter. He chewed up Price's legs in that fight and occasionally goes to the body. He's Price is kind of the thing Price has in his back pocket is that he's a weirdly effective ground and pounder and a decent scrambler, and Luque is better than that as well. I don't think he's necessarily the worst matchup for Price in the division. I think that's actually Tyron Woodley, but I think Luque is still a pretty poisonous style matchup.
Gosh, I want to see Nico Price versus Tyron Woodley.
I think it would probably be Nico Price getting knocked out in short order.
Probably, just running into a right hand. But, you know, I feel fairly certain he would be willing to run into that right hand, although you never know. That Woodley staring match psychs a lot of people out you wouldn't expect it to. Yeah, I think what I'm looking for here is, does Nico Price do something different? Does he just try to trade early rather than allowing Luque to get the fight he wants? Even if he doesn't, he's always exciting because he's going to be dangerous in those moments when Luque is trying to sort of put the cap on him. That's when Price has to throw back, and he may not be as physically durable as Vicente Luque, nor is mentally durable. Let's be honest. His technique sort of falls apart as well when he's getting tagged. But he does have a certain kind of resilience, and he remains dangerous no matter what. He's like a really dumb Juan Manuel Marquez, where like instead of going ice cold and getting super focused, he just turns into a fucking maniac and starts swinging when he's hurt. And it makes him dangerous. The other thing, I guess, is like, how does Vicente Luque look after a very tough loss to Stephen Thompson? In which he was not knocked out, but was hurt badly several times in that fight. So who knows? That may have
and a vicious war with Mike Perry. I mean, those are two very hard fights back to back.
Yeah, so who knows? But all things considered, I agree with you that Price is like sort of a reactive fighter in general. That he sort of just bases what he's doing on what the opponent either forces or allows him to do. And so probably, knowing Vicente Luque, he's going to come forward, and Nico Price is going to lose this one either until it's over or until he doesn't lose. But how about this preliminary fight, Phil? Chito Vera, Ray Borg. I want to. I do this every time I mention him, but I'm proud of this piece. I like it. I wrote a piece called "Why I Love Chito Vera," and I think you should read it because I
Great
like.
Piece.
Oh, thank you. I like those weird, cathartic characters that occupy MMA, and Chito Vera is just the best the best micro Lionheart going in the game right now. And also, there's the fact that he is, in a way that I really couldn't have anticipated and didn't in that article, he is getting genuinely much better and more savvy as a fighter. But I kind of think Ray Borg's a tough one for him. What do you think?
This is a weird matchup.
It's weird because it's Borg up at bantamweight, which is still a weird thing to wrap my head around.
Yeah, because Chito has had a number of, he's on a decent streak at the moment.
Oh yeah.
But of his wins and his performances, his UFC career in general, it's hard to find like determined wrestlers in there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who is the best wrestler that Chito has fought?
Brian Kelleher.
It's Brian Kelleher, yeah.
And then maybe Brad Pickett.
Mm-hmm.
Or I don't know, maybe Nolan Hernandez. Like all of these guys got him down too, you know?
Yeah, because he's been someone, he has the classic action fighter game in that he's willing to fight pretty much anywhere, which means he's a big sprint grappler, fight from guard guy if given the opportunity, and he's good at it. We've seen him submit people off his back, including Brian Kelleher.
Mm-hmm.
But it also means that we don't really know. I can't really tell how he's going to hold up against Ray Borg's wrestling. But on the other hand, Ray Borg has not really worked very well as a bantamweight.
Yeah.
It's been a bit of a struggle for him. Like that Casey Kenny fight. I mean, he simply is not having the same level of success that he did at flyweight.
Granted, I think Casey Kenny is a tough style matchup for him and has proven to be a very good fighter. Yes. And it's been 3 fights. But yeah, it's clear that even if Ray Borg settles in eventually, it's been a process through which like he needs to settle into the division. He has not looked at home here the way he just sort of easily slotted in at 125.
Yeah. I mean, at 125, he was able to beat Jussier Formiga. I mean,
sure.
That is an elite win.
Yeah.
Whereas he's just been an okay bantamweight. And I think that's fairly informative of how he's going to perform. And I think I actually favor Chito reasonably strongly in this one. And I think the reason why is that Justin Scoggins fight for Borg. Borg is someone who does not generally tend to make Scoggins is someone who doesn't necessarily tend to make the greatest decisions in grappling situations.
True.
He's been taken out by any number of weird subs. And so a lot of people were thinking when this fight came up that, Borg is a guy who just takes people down. He's an aggressive grappler. He teleports to the back. Scoggins is just going to get RNC'd. And it really didn't happen. And Borg just got absolutely carved up from the outside. And I think that, as much as he seems like a short, squat power fighter, he's not one in the same way that he actually, bursts into range with, overhands and level change mix-ups. He really does not like being at a significant reach disadvantage and being picked off in that way. His shots became very telegraphed in that fight.
Yes.
Scoggins actually fought to be fair to Scoggins, he fought probably the best fight of his career in that he disengaged from grappling when he should have. He kind of rolled through when he needed to. I mean, it was Justin Scoggins for one fight being the guy that everyone thought he could be. But I don't think that basic style paradigm goes away. And whilst Cheeto isn't the kind of kicker or determined outfighter that Scoggins is, he's a much more violent guy. And, stuff like his clinch that we saw against John Lineker, if he gets his clinch rolling against shorter people, I think he really fucks them up. Oh yeah,
even against people his height, like that sort of Muay Thai lock. He kept trapping Andre Ewell in his last fight.
Yeah,
get in that tight head position and then grab one wrist and pinch his elbows down and just smash Ewell's head between the forearm, pinching the nerve in his neck on one side and his own forehead against his jaw on the other side, and then just go to work with knees. He's a brutal clinch fighter, no doubt.
Yeah. So, I mean, I tend to think there's just too much of an offense disparity between these two, at this weight class, and that I just don't think Borg is comfortable facing big height and length. A big height and length disadvantage.
Yeah, I think you're right. He's, you can accuse me of sadness hedging. I'm still leaning the other way here. I think you're right about that. Borg he's a rote fighter. He doesn't have a whole lot of, as a striker, as a scrambler, he's comfortable. He's natural. He makes decisions without really having to think. He just sort of reacts and goes. As a striker, his moves, they read very rote to me. They're very, practiced. We worked this combination on the pads. Now, it works for him better than some other Jackson Wink fighters because he is a great athlete. It's a little more like the roteness that you would see from, Manny Pacquiao, who, Freddie Roach definitely made Manny Pacquiao something of a rote striker. He had a certain set number of combinations he liked to throw, and that's how eventually Juan Manuel Marquez knocked him out. But, so that works well for Borg. He's able to do that double pump feint and press people back to close the distance and whatever. But stuck at range, yeah, he runs out of ideas. He's not that clever. He's not that comfortable. One thing he does though is hit big strong guy double legs on people. And, I watched that Justin Scoggins fight. Justin Scoggins had to do a hell of a lot of hard wrestling in order to get the striking battle that he ended up comfortably winning against Borg. He had to do a shitload of dynamic takedown defense in the first 2 or 3 minutes of that fight because he wanted to throw kicks, and every time Scoggins threw a kick, Borg grabbed his leg and hit a hard double and got him down briefly, if nothing more. And I just don't think Cheeto Vera has that kind of. I don't think he has the urgency. Again, this is something that's improved for him. He has a better sense of getting back to his feet, of using the space created by his submissions to escape than he used to. Where he, back in the old days, he would just stay on his back for round after round. It's like his loss to Davey Grant was just an incredibly frustrating guard performance. But more importantly, I just don't think he has the level of wrestling to not get taken down. And if it's a matchup in which Borg can take someone down, and if it's Chito Vera, a fighter who has rarely beaten a wrestler, and when he does, it's by submitting them after getting taken down, I just don't think Borg is I don't think he gives enough opportunities on the ground, honestly, for Chito Vera to be expected to win off of his back. And I see him ending up on his back more than once in this fight. I just don't know. Borg is an insistent wrestler, and the more uncomfortable he gets in striking, the more insistent he becomes in shooting takedowns. And yeah, to me, the question is, how good is Chito Vera's takedown defense? It's not, not that great.
That's fair enough. Yeah, I'm just not sure I trust. This is the thing, is that normally when we see people move up in weight, their striking gets better, but Borg only seems more desperate to wrestle up at bantamweight.
Right.
And while I can definitely see him just winning a pure grappling and control fight, it does increasingly feel like that's his only kind of fight. He's really losing a lot of his ability to actually put a stamp on rounds and hurt people or finish them in any way. He has to win huge amounts of top control in order to actually win rounds, because he's not really getting anything done.
Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true. He might just lose on offense, even if he's on top. Might just get outworked. All I know is that Chito Vera needs to press Borg backwards and make him uncomfortable to win, and that's just the best way for Chito Vera to fight usually. And in previous fights, whenever I see somebody, people usually actually don't have an easy time pressuring Borg. He does use those feints and whatnot to push people back. But B, when they pressure him, when they do push him back, he just tends to catch a kick and hit a reactive takedown. That's my main concern. I really do think it's that simple for me. Not saying you're definitely wrong or anything, but that's the feeling I have about this matchup. Call it a sadness hedge, if you will.
It's fair enough. We've seen Chito struggle with getting physically outmuscled a bunch of times. Most specifically against Douglas Da Silva. Yeah,
I do think he's a stronger man as well. He's growing into his body quite a bit. But this is also a guy who just got out wrestled, as I said, by Davy Grant. Mm-hmm. And I think he's better in many ways since then. But also Ray Borg is a better grappler than Davy Grant.
We are really coming with the hot takes.
Okay, let's take a break, goddammit. When we come back, we're going to talk about... I don't know if I really properly introduced this topic idea. I don't think I did. We're going to talk about underrated technicians from MMA history. Guys like Kazuo Misaki, like Martin Kampmann, like Chris Lytle, and more after this.
Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it.
All right, welcome back to Heavy Hands. As I totally failed to smoothly introduce, I think, at the top of the show, now that I think back to it, we are talking about some underrated technicians. And really, I don't know, the term technician, some of these guys are more, this is me getting kind of wonky, I guess, or not wonky. This is me getting very woo-woo. What's the distinction between a technician and a craftsman? I don't know. But I would describe some of these guys in their less technical, their less textbook moments as nonetheless very crafty fighters. A lot of these are experienced fighters without sort of game-breaking athletic talent, who just have really functional games, and can respond to a wide variety of problems in the ring or cage. And the first of those, all-time great action fighter, a man that I just kind of realized recently, like, I used to hear mentioned daily, multiple times daily, back in like the Sherdog forum days. People had the proper respect for this man's career, and no longer do I really hear people bringing up his name. It's Chris motherfucking Lytle. And if you forgot, you should go watch some Chris Lytle. This man is an all-time great action fighter. Sort of like one of our other all-time great action fighters in Jim Miller, a really underrated technician as well. There's a lot to Chris Lytle's game, a lot of sort of breadth and flexibility to his game that I don't think he gets credit for, just because strategically he was kind of a nut bar. But yeah, Chris Lytle. Phil, you were the one who insisted on having him on this list. Why is that?
So, I mean, one of the things we think of is MMA as a sport which has made a transition from, relatively defined archetypes of striker and grappler to being more well-rounded ones who have then, built out into subtler descriptions like, pressure fighter or whatever. But essentially, this idea that and it sort of went through several eras of like sprawl and brawlers and wrestlers and all this other kind of stuff. But the thing is that often this kind of broad brush characterization does tend to miss out on the idea that there were a bunch of guys throughout history who were actually like throughout MMA history and the UFC and Pride who were pretty skilled everywhere in most of those like broad brush skill sets. There were guys who had depth in almost every area, and maybe there were certain things which kept them from progressing further than that. And yeah, I think Chris Lytle, that's why I mentioned him, is because pretty much for the same reason you did. We don't hear about guys like Chris Lytle anymore. There's a whole kind of generation of fighters that people love that just sort of slip out of view. He was pretty much the Donald Cerrone of his era. The guy that you absolutely had to watch. And, like you said, no one talks about him anymore. And they should, because he was cool, and you can learn fun things by watching him.
Yeah, like I said, not just a shockingly intelligent fighter looking back, but like all his fights are fun. So if you haven't watched Chris Lytle, God forbid if you're listening to this show and this is like the first you've heard of Chris Lytle, go watch Chris Lytle. Do yourself a favor. So we wanted to look at these guys and also sort of identify like some of their peak performances. And I think you had a pretty good shout, honestly, yesterday with what was actually Chris Lytle's final fight. And that kind of surprised me because I had seen this fight once or twice before. But it's Chris Lytle looking good. This is a man at the end of a pretty crazy career. But it was his battle with Dan Hardy in 2011. And, this was when like, I guess it was at the end of Dan Hardy's, losing streak, to be fair. So maybe not the best Dan Hardy it could have been back in those days. I think maybe the Dan Hardy that beat Marcus Davis, for example, another underrated and somewhat forgotten technician for his day. Maybe that might have gone differently, but really it's just Chris Lytle like walking Dan Hardy down and beating him up with punches. It's like Chris Lytle doing a Ken Norton impression, just coming in with a jab, slipping and jabbing the body as often as he jabs the head, and just winging big-ass right hands to the body. And then every once in a while, beaning Hardy with the right hand upstairs or a left hook upstairs because he has to worry about these huge right hooks that keep thudding into his ribs. And it's just a good, like, methodical, steady pressure performance with really intelligent shot selection. And also some decent head movement from Chris Lytle.
Yeah, so taking a step back, who was Chris Lytle? He was pretty much a boxer in MMA. He was one of these guys where he could low kick. We didn't do it that much. And if you wanted to box with him and you wanted to stand in the pocket with him, he was very, very dangerous. He was mostly a sprint grappler guy from his back. He could be taken down and controlled. And in general, he was one of these guys where just the fact that he had a front foot heavy stance meant that he really kind of got carved up by leg kicks as well, as when he fought Thiago Alves, even though that fight was unfortunately stopped by a cut. But yeah, I mean, this was one of those classic fights where, against Dan Hardy, I mean, this is not only the best retirement fight in MMA, with the possible exception of GSP versus Bisping.
Yeah.
But it's also that classic example of the younger guy fighting the older guy, and they both have really similar games, and the older guy is just like, oh yeah, I understand everything about this. This is exactly how I do things.
Zane Simon's classic OG fight.
Yep.
Yeah.
And yeah, like you said, Dan Hardy, I mean, I think his problem always would have been, I think, in this fight, that he was hugely over-specialized to just look for left hooks and the left hook counter. And Lytle just kept keeping it at home by just banging his own right to the body.
Mm-hmm.
And Hardy just kept not wanting to lift his elbow to throw after a while.
Yep.
And he did manage to, stagger and I think hurt Lytle a couple of times in this fight, which is, as I said, a great fight. But Lytle was able to bring more concerted pressure, and it was one of those. It ended up being one of those kind of cruelly ironic performances, because Dan Hardy was one of those guys that, like McGregor, and Dan Hardy, for those who also don't know this, was sort of like the mouthy person from the United Kingdom and Ireland. He was sort of that guy in the UFC at the time.
How many of your guys aren't that guy? Brad Pickett's the only nice person your country's ever put into the octagon. That's it. Everyone else is a Michael Bisping.
Leon Edwards. Nathaniel Wood.
I don't know. Leon Edwards had some big shit to talk until Jorge Masvidal hit him with the sucker punch.
That is true. And we all know Arnold Allen seems nice in the cage, but has a huge temper on him. Fair enough. You win.
Ooh.
We're dickheads.
Yeah, I wasn't even thinking of that.
But yeah, but Hardy is one of those guys who complained about everyone wrestling with him, and of course the fight ends with him getting beaten up by Lytle and then shooting into a guillotine.
Love it. Oh, you're wrestling now. Yeah, you're a wrestler. Yeah, but keep in mind, this was Chris Lytle 12 years into a, 54 fight career. This was his 54th professional fight. And this is a man renowned for his action fighting style. So it wasn't an easy career. Him getting shaken up by Hardy a couple times, even that sort of wipes away somewhat the asterisk that Hardy was at the end of a losing streak. But Lytle had an incredibly good run at the end of his career too. I think that more than anything speaks to the real depth of his craft and his versatility as a fighter. Right at the end of his career, he beat Matt Brown. That's the second time I think he beat him, actually. He beat Matt Serra. He lost a weird decision to Brian Ebersol in that brief period of time where everyone was losing weird decisions to Brian Ebersol.
It was a strange time.
It really was. And then he beat Dan Hardy, and he retired.
And he beat Brian Foster as well, which I think is a super underrated win.
Sure.
Brian Foster was a Hulk.
Yes. So just an incredibly impressive career. And yeah, I like sort of remembering that Chris Lytle was not just very fun, but actually very good for his time. And sort of ahead of his time in a lot of ways. Also, one of the things I like, and this is why I sort of make the distinction between technique and craft, is there's a lot of stuff you will see Chris Lytle do in this fight or in many others that is not great technique. he's like throwing himself off balance. He's really front foot heavy, so almost every time he throws his right hand, his back foot like drifts forward an awful lot. His head movement is kind of improvised, messy territory, taking his eyes off of his opponent, ducking. But you can watch this fight and see that he knows what makes Hardy dangerous, and he's ready for it. And he's coming in and attacking and methodically, consistently getting his head out of the way after he attacks. Even if he's off balance, he knows when he's vulnerable, and he takes steps to account for that. He was a clever fighter. He understood the sort of rhythm of a fight, even if his technique wasn't perfect. So, Chris Lytle, a true OG, and you should do yourself a favor and have like a long marathon of basically his whole UFC career, because why the fuck not? Pretty much every fight is a banger. But let's
Except that Eversole one.
Well, yeah. Don't just skip if you're doing any classic fighter marathons, watching their careers. You could just skip their fights with Brian Ebersole. None of them was particularly fun, to be honest. Although still maybe worth seeing. He was weird, interesting character.
The Elias Theodoru of his day.
He really was. Yes. But the next guy we have listed to talk about is one of my personal favorite guys to watch. I don't claim to be an expert on the totality of his career. I've seen fewer of his fights, I think, than I have Chris Lytle's. But he's one of those fighters that really strikes you as sort of a pioneer of a style of fighting we still don't actually see all that often in MMA. And I'm talking, of course, about the great Kazuo Misaki. And we're not just going to do like people's last fights as their peak fights. But just before we sort of try to break down who Kazuo Misaki was, I want to say that we are going to recommend you watch his retirement fight with Paul Daly. Because Kazuo Misaki, at like, I don't know, he's 43 now. This was back in 2012. So he was 35. Did I do the math right on that?
Around that.
35, 36, somewhere in that neighborhood. It was his welterweight debut. He was not a huge man, but he had spent his entire career basically in Japan fighting up at 185. And he came into a fight with Paul Daly and turned Paul Daly into a motherfucking wrestler. And that's how you know that he, just like Chris Lytle against Dan Hardy, is a true OG of the MMA striking game. He made Paul Daly wrestle. Way, way, way before Michael Venom Page produced a similar fight from Paul Daly. Misaki was mentally breaking him in the cage, scaring him off, even trying to throw that famous left hook, getting gashed open with a huge elbow on the ground, and then just spending the entire rest of the fight after that point walking Paul Daly down with his hands at his waist, menacing him. And I fucking love that fight. And I do think it sums up a lot of what makes Kazuo Misaki such a lovable fighter.
Yeah, I mean, because as we said, you can have contextual action fights. You can have guys who
sure.
Aren't particularly fun if you put them into or guys whose game falls apart if you put them into a particular type of fight. And if you told me Kazuo Misaki has just completely neutralized Paul Daly, I would have been like, oh yeah, did he grapple him then? No.
Right.
Paul Daly was the grappler.
Yeah.
Kazuo Misaki was the striker, but that obviously wasn't his A game. And it's great to watch. Like he's someone who could fight in his B style and beat one of MMA's most feared specialists there.
He sort of reminds you of like Jussier Formiga. Like maybe there's not a great deal of depth or variety to what Formiga likes to do as a striker, but he is like efficient and professional with how he carries himself. He maintains a good distance. He moves his feet very well. That was an essential part of this win over Paul Daly, and basically every other striking win and throughout Misaki's career. And Daly was not the only guy that he beat primarily by outstriking them. But he had a jab. He could set up his right hand. He could change rhythm. He had a feel for striking. It wasn't just like it didn't feel like a B game, honestly. Even if it wasn't as complex as his grappling game, he was very comfortable as a striker and could therefore make smart decisions to fight differently. Sometimes counterpunching, like that Daly fight, starts out counterpunching. The first shot Misaki lands, if I recall correctly, that really sort of turns the tide is like a right hand counter off the back foot. And it ends up being like a pressure fighting performance. Once again, just like Lytle, a very flexible fighter who can adapt in intelligent ways to the sort of changing circumstances of the fight he finds himself in. The other one, though, that you really have to watch, and if you haven't seen this already, like, what are you doing? Everyone agrees, one of the best fights ever. Kazuo Misaki versus Jorge Santiago. Their first fight from, what was it, Road FC?
I think, of the two, I mean, I think the second one is generally considered to be the better one.
Oh, sorry.
Right?
You are correct.
So that was, Sengoku 14. That was the rematch. And this is going to be one of the ones, I mean, Misaki does not win this fight.
Yeah.
But Jorge Santiago, he was one of these guys we could talk about as well.
True.
He would definitely be in this, because everyone had a flaw that kept them back.
Right.
And Misaki's, with Lytle, it was his wrestling defense and his stance and his just willingness to sell out. With Misaki, I think it was pace. I think he knew that he couldn't, he parceled out his offense.
Yeah.
And if people didn't get intimidated by it, he could be in trouble. And with Santiago, it was his chin. But the match between him and Santiago I think it's possibly the best fight of what we would consider like the Japanese style of MMA. Because it is a fight which goes everywhere. It goes through mount and back control, and it has striking and flying knees, and there's almost no definition to where that fight goes.
Right.
It's just everyone takes everything as it comes, and it's just it's similar to Poirier Korean Zombie in that way. It has amazing grappling. It has, vicious striking. It has a dramatic, tragic end, which is, only really beaten out by Lawler McDonald too. Yeah, everyone should watch that fight.
It's in my mind, it's just like a scrambly blur, but yeah, but that's the it's like a flow grappling match. Like that's sort of the Japanese school of MMA fight in a lot of ways, I guess. These are fights you don't see nearly as often unless you go down to like flyweight in the U.S. and in the so-called Western MMA. But yeah, it's just a fight where like both guys. I don't know. Is it just a matchup thing? Is it like a sort of culture thing? It's hard to say. But it's a fight where both guys come in and just don't particularly care about keeping the fight in one place or another. They don't seem to have any notion of strategy. It's just like, hey, I have moves for literally all of these situations. Let's go. It's a thing of beauty. It really is.
Yeah.
But again, watch Misaki versus Paul Daly. Cause like in that one, once again, a demonstration of craft rather than technique. Misaki doesn't fight a super high paced fight. He never did. I agree with you. I think that was a major flaw for him throughout his long career. But in like the third round of that fight, he totally makes up for doing very little by just walking Paul Daly down with blood streaming down his face from a ugly gash on his eyebrow. And like, yeah, he just cows Paul Daly. That's the thing. Sometimes he could suffer for lack of pace, but man, he could really cover it up and make you feel like he was fighting at a fast pace by pressuring and feinting and just making you reactive, even though he wasn't actually doing all that much offensively. Very, very clever in its way, and also really fucking badass to see Misaki just dropping his hands and strolling after Paul Daly. Okay, that's Kazuo Misaki.
I'm noticing a theme here, Connor.
Yes?
It's like, oh yeah, we're going to watch some great technicians from history who just happened to close out their careers on wins by making British people look like bitches.
Hey, it's not that hard. Heavy Hands will be back after this.
Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. You can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show.
All right, Heavy Hands is back. Phil and I just had to scream at each other for a good 10 or so minutes. We're fine, right, Phil? We're good, right? But for this segment, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but man, I love both of these fighters. And once again, you know I'm a contrarian. The more like forgotten these guys get, the more like wistful and enthusiastic I get when I think back on them. These are once again how to introduce this? It's Martin Kampmann and Mark Hominick. Mark Hominick had a really promising career, actually. Did a lot of impressive things, and then lost to Jose Aldo in a competitive fight, more competitive than most Jose Aldo fights. And then had a tragedy in his life, and his career basically collapsed. He had his coach, I believe, who I think was also his brother-in-law or some sort of relation like that, and a close friend passed away, and it had a big effect on Hominick's sort of confidence and desire to fight. And then he got knocked out in 7 seconds or so by the Korean Zombie, and that was pretty much it for Mark Hominick. He had a little more after that. I think he fought man, as soon as you remind me of the name, I'm going to get very sad. Who was the last guy that he fought?
Paulo Garza?
Wait a minute. Is that the one I'm thinking of? Is it even sadder if that is the right fight and I've just utterly...
The Scarecrow?
Oh,
and yeah, and it was super depressing.
Actually, the one I really remember is when he got outstruck by Eddie Yagin.
Oh, yeah. No, okay, no more talking about the sad endings.
Right. So it sucked, and I think that contributed, sort of similar to Mike Brown, who also, he had a brief time at the top, but shone really brightly while he was there, at the peak of his powers. I think it's contributed to people sort of forgetting about Mark Hominick. And, he was really fucking good. And then Martin Kampmann, on the other hand, as you well know, if you've ever listened to Joe Rogan on commentary, is the most technical striker ever to set foot in the octagon, mostly because he do the guard. He put his hands up high. They by the face go.
He also punches straight.
He punched straight. Yeah. Well, thank you for tuning into this week's episode of Heavy Hands. We will catch you guys next week. Let's talk about Mark Hominick a little bit first. What is the Mark Hominick game? How does it function? What makes it great?
Once again, all these guys are have sort of similarities. Mm-hmm. Not least of which that Mark Hominick looks very much like a tiny Martin Kampmann.
Yeah.
But he was primarily a boxer and a very crafty one. Mm-hmm. He had a great, deceptive lead hand. He was the first person long before Max Holloway. He was the first person to suggest that, for example, Jose Aldo could be really troubled by doubling up on jabs and working the body. So he was a very crafty boxer, but had a very aggressive, fun scrambling game on the bottom as well, mm-hmm. and was a decent, if not incredible, wrestler. And yeah, he was just, again, another guy where it was very, very tough to put him into boring fights.
It's true. I really don't think of it often, but like sometimes Mark Hominick just decided to take someone down. He could like time it and set it up really well. You know, he was also one of those the first examples of guys I think of as someone whose wrestling game is largely informed by their striking. Like by his footwork and positioning and the timing that he uses to create combinations. That sets up his takedowns as well, like an Alexander Gustafsson kind of shot machine. But yeah, I like Mark Hominick a lot because he, like you said, it's sort of a proto Max Holloway. Like he had a sort of comfort with his hands that we still don't see very often in MMA. He could really sort of turn the dial on whatever punch he was throwing and decide if it was going to be relaxed and quick and snappy, or if it was going to be hard and powerful. He would throw certain punches away. He would vary up the rhythm of his combinations. Pretty much everything flowed off of that really nice jab. But Hominick could hook off the jab. He could follow with the right hand. He would hit the body. He was just a really, like, a pretty limited game, mostly boxing, that he confined himself to, but a really flexible boxer. And one thing that he did that Martin Kampmann didn't, he's a smaller version of Martin Kampmann, which in MMA usually means a better version. Mark Hominick was a better defensive fighter as well. It was really something that held Martin Kampmann back, rather. We'll talk about that in a moment. But Mark Hominick was one of those guys who would show impressive defense without ever really like integrating it into his game. It's sort of like when Tony Ferguson shows flashes of good defense, and you're like, man, why don't you do this all the time? And then you watch most of his combinations, and to me, the problem with like guys like Tony Ferguson and Mark Hominick is that they throw the shot, and then they wait to see what you're going to do. They don't like anticipate or start improving their position right away. They sort of hang out. They kind of want to hang out in range and then react, really like truly react to what you're doing next with no anticipation. But Mark Hominick, especially once he sort of got into the flow of a fight, he could do that pretty well. That's a big part too of why he gave Jose Aldo such trouble, is that he was able to get in shots on him. And once the fight started rolling, after the first few exchanges and Aldo started to slow down a bit, Hominick was slipping and pulling away and countering a lot of Jose Aldo's punches. And he forced Aldo to come up with some pretty aggressive adjustments of his own to counteract that. But I kind of think it's an underrated part of his game. It's not integrated as naturally as it could be, but he did have defensive moves, and it was always a pleasure watching Hominick settle into the fight and start to get a feel for when he could move his head and how.
Yeah, it helped to set up those shots on Aldo because he was able to sell his head movement as fakes to get Aldo moving offline, and he ended up, as the fight went on, like you said, he was starting to land his right hand. He was starting to push Aldo out of position in the same way that Max Holloway was able to. Yeah. But the problem with Mark Hominick is that he was way smaller than Max Holloway, and that Aldo could basically just, if Aldo bit down, he could just overpower Hominick in pretty much every area that he wanted to. Yeah.
Arguably a little worse off athletically than Max Holloway, but without any of the size that really makes up for that in Holloway's case.
Yeah. So Aldo was just able to, if he just wanted to trade punches with low kicks or punches with punches, or if he just wanted to take Hominick down, there was a limited amount that Hominick could do to stop him. But yeah, I mean, so for the great Hominick fights to watch, that is obviously the one. Again, it's another sort of slightly tragic performance, but he has his great sort of surging fifth round where he got Aldo down, which would then contribute to this idea of Aldo having a completely trash gas tank for the next however many years and basically earned him Joe Rogan's hatred forever.
We should have watched that one on the sick edition of The Depressed Us.
That's a good point.
Because that's the story of that one.
It's too good, though.
Yeah, it's a great fight.
But his other great fight is, I think, Yves Jabouet.
Yes, I was going to say the same one.
Another, and again, this is another person who is sort of
right
Hominic's mirror. And they have this kind of great fight where they're both exactly prepared for everywhere that they're going to go. And it ends with an amazing body shot finish, which you can't hate on at all.
Both of the Yves could have been on this episode, to be honest. Yves Jabouet and Yves Edwards. Both really underrated striking technicians who were well ahead of their time. But yeah, definitely. Like, if you just don't... You missed the era if you don't hear Hominick versus Yves Jabouet and immediately think, oh my god, I want to fire up Fight Pass and watch that matchup again. I want to remind myself how it played out. But you should. Fun fight. Mark Hominick, great fighter. Let's say just a few words about Martin Kampmann. This is back up at welterweight. I joked before, but that's because Joe Rogan had a real fascination with the sort of textbook look of Martin Kampmann's game. It's funny because there were some major flaws that kept Kampmann's game from being perfectly functional. And I think we agree, Phil, that like prime among those is just bad defense.
Yeah.
Like
defense.
Was just not a very good defensive fighter. I said he didn't have a great chin, but honestly, it took like a perfect shot from Johnny Hendricks to really knock Martin Kampmann out. There were plenty of fights in which he got hurt and recovered. It was just that he would get hit really clean. He had a very like that era K1 approach to defense, the kind of defense that really suffers without the big gloves, because it was pretty much just a static high guard. And, there was some parrying mixed in there as well. There was really no head movement. There was not as much like respect for range as there could be. He had a lifelong habit of backing straight up when people surged at him and hiding behind this static high guard. So that's a problem that really affected Kampmann throughout his career. But the reason I think that Joe Rogan looks at someone who keeps their hands really high and he thinks no matter what happens in the fight that they're being really technical, because that's how a lot of people think about boxing. But more importantly, on offense, Martin Kampmann is a really attractive fighter to watch. There is a really nice, relaxed flow, and he too set himself apart as a technician by being such a relaxed puncher. Was someone who would hurt people without seeming to try to hurt them, without really having to put any muscle or extra oomph into his punches. Just a nice, smooth weight transfer, nice, relaxed rotation. The shots just kind of flick out, and they string together really well, too.
Yeah, and the other things which made Kampmann work is that he was a really good fighter in tons of different areas. Yeah. So Rogan would, generally hype up his striking, even as someone was just clocking him round the head with a left hook. But he was a very good clinch fighter. He was a surprisingly effective wrestler. And again, mostly this was a kind of clinch and body lock takedown game, sort of slightly reminiscent of Neil Magny.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, he would be a great person to probably teach Neil Magny things.
Yeah, he probably would, because even his limited defense would work a lot better with just Magny's reach. If he could just get Magny, I mean, frankly, the performance Magny showed against the Leech last time out was a lot more like something Martin Kampmann might have done.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he's been working with him.
Yeah, and he was a really deep grappler.
Yeah.
So he famously had... He had the fight with Jake Shields, which was, for those who haven't watched it, it is essentially the Masvidal Maya of its day.
Mm.
Because it was Shields coming out to wrestle and to grapple, and Kampmann basically just saying, all right, we can do that. Fine, I'm a good grappler. I can grapple with you.
Yep.
And coming really close to winning. And, arguably, for many people, actually winning. And, we saw how GSP treated Shields. He treated the ground like it was radioactive in that fight. But, Kampmann could grapple with pretty much anyone. He was not only a strong, positional grappler, he had a nasty guillotine. He was just, and again, so this was all recipe for an amazing action fighter.
I'm convinced there's. Oh, please finish your thought.
I mean, because we sort of noticed this about UFC 189 when we watched it, is that a real recipe for action fights is also not having much defense. So, if you saw a Kampmann fight, there was a solid chance he was going to get hurt. There was a solid chance he was going to hurt the other guy. If they tried to take him down, he was a great, exciting grappler. And if they didn't, he was a relaxed and dangerous striker on the feet.
I'm fairly convinced that there is a gene in Scandinavian blood that clearly Martin Kampmann and Gunnar Nelson both share. But one of his great virtues as an action fighter, Martin Kampmann, and frankly, maybe we should have called this underrated action fighters because that's pretty much what all these guys are. But one of his great attributes is just how calm he stayed, and I think that's a big part of what made him so effective as a grappler, is like Jorge Masvidal, he didn't get psyched out by someone taking him down. If it was a fight where he thought his best shot was on the feet, he would just do the right grappling moves. He wasn't afraid to just use his grappling technique to survive a bad situation. He didn't get psyched out by the fact that an opponent might be, the grappler in this matchup. And I think a great example of that is his later fight with Jake Ellenberger too, in which Ellenberger, that one's sort of like Robbie Lawler versus Josh Koscheck, where Ellenberger gets his way early, he gets Kampmann down. When someone is a good wrestler and they want to get Kampmann down, it usually happens. And in very Jorge Masvidal style, Kampmann, he gets his back to the cage. He starts working on a guillotine, and he uses that to leverage his way out. He just very slowly, methodically, and technically works his way back to his feet. And then round 2 comes around, and he basically just walks Ellenberger down, knees him to pieces in the clinch, and knocks him out. But it's a really great performance from someone who sort of ostensibly gives their opponent their fight in the early going, and kind of beats them in their fight. And only after beating Ellenberger on the ground, only after sort of out-wrestling him, does Kampmann then do what you might have expected and outstrike him. And finishes him. So, yeah. Yeah,
and it's all the best. It's some of the best things about, and it's the best and worst of Kampmann in that fight, I think. Because, and this was when, this fight was sort of the beginning of the end for Jake Ellenberger.
Yeah.
Because he was the coming man in this fight.
Mm-hmm.
He was, he had however many wins in a row in the UFC. He'd only lost one fight in the UFC, which was stupid. He shouldn't even have lost it because
the Carlos Condit fight that he definitely won because he knocked Carlos Condit down 6 times.
I mean, it's a draw at the very worst. It's a draw. There's no way that fight.
But there's a 10-7 round in that fight. He almost kills.
Absolutely splatters Condit.
Yeah.
In the first round, and so after that, Ellenberger was just on an absolute tear, and if you were going to match up 2 people and you were going to say, this guy has just incredible power in his hands, and he'd knocked out Jake Shields. Ellenberger had.
Also, I think after some kind of loss in Jake Shields' life, another sort of sad story on the side there. Yeah. But he knocked the hell out of Jake Shields. Yeah.
And Ellenberger is, I think, he's still one of the biggest hitters in MMA.
Agreed.
I think he's more of a hitter than, say, for example, Johnny Hendricks.
Yes.
Because Ellenberger never really seemed to have to try that much, whereas Hendricks, exploded through the air to knock people out.
Yeah.
Ellenberger was one of those guys who could just hit people and then they just died.
He had more of Dan Henderson kind of power. he would just fling his weight into the shot. It wasn't that quick compared to Johnny Hendricks or someone. And yeah, it just smashed through whatever it hit.
So in this fight, you could see like Kampmann's terrible defense coming down back to haunt him on several occasions as he just got clobbered moving backwards. You could see his grappling saving him, and you could see his kind of calmness under fire. And in the end, the fight, the punch that sort of starts the end it's a very Martin Kampmann punch. It's the one where you could see it because it's a relaxed, gentle seeming, accurate punch to the temple.
Mm-hmm.
And Ellenberger just does the stanky leg,
yes,
and then gets chainsawed with ease.
Yep, it's like this tiny little Volkan Özdemir-esque right hand, this short little right hand right in the temple. Super, super easy. I love it. It's like he doesn't even try to hurt Ellenberger. That's what I mean. Like, it's just a well-placed shot, and it happens right in the middle of Ellenberger swinging, which once again demonstrates the fearlessness that was essential to Martin Kampmann's no-defense style ever working. Is that he hit Ellenberger when he was most vulnerable, which is also the most dangerous time to try to hit him. And he hit him like he barely cared to put him away, and Ellenberger just exploded. So, yeah, love Martin Kampmann. All of these guys' careers are worth revisiting. We could easily do another episode like this because over the course of talking about these careers, we thought of like 4 or 5 other fighters that we just don't hear about much anymore because they never became an all-time great or whatever that's going to be remembered by everyone who cares about MMA. But they were great fighters, man. So yeah, thank you for listening to this week's episode of Heavy Hands. Hopefully, I mean, I don't know if I should even say hopefully because it's probably not a good idea that it does happen. But apparently there's some UFC shit happening in 2 weeks. So come back to us next week, provided nothing changes in the meantime. We are most likely going to be previewing the main and co-main, the big fights of UFC, 249?
Yep, that's the one.
Okay. So, Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje, as cruel a matchup as ever was made in the UFC, and on a private island, no less. Find us on social media if you care to. You can find Phil on Twitter at Evil Greg Jackson and myself at Boxing Bush, BUSCH. Check out our work on Bloody Elbow. And once again, make sure you check out Heavy Hands on Patreon. For $3 a month, you can get access to all of our bonus episodes. And that does include yet another sort of celebration of some less celebrated than they should be fighters in Mike McCallum and Sumbu Kalambe. So if you want to watch some classic, brilliantly technical boxers in what I will put up as the true example of what a chess match in fighting looks like, not this Adesanya Romero shit, but a real chess match, then you should check out the Heavy Hands Patreon and give us $3, please. Thank you. If you guys came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. Bye.
You know what I think this has been?
Huh.
Heavy Hands.
How did I actually not see that coming?